Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Sensing the Past 2, part of the Uncommon Senses 5 conference. And just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities, examine research questions, projects, things happening across the university. And we're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting also. So those of you joining us there, we would love your comments and questions via the chat, and we're happy to read those out. Those of you here in the space with us, just raise your hand during the Q&A and we'll bring a microphone over to you. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Professor in Department of Sociology and Anthropology, but also the co-director of the Center for Sensory Studies, Concordia University, David Howes. David, over to you.
Thank you, Douglas, and really thank you very much for making the facilities of Fourth Space available to us this afternoon and this morning. In terms of the mobilization of knowledge, Fourth Space is unparalleled. So it means a great deal for us to have this opportunity to get the word out about sensory studies. And I have the pleasure today to introduce three very dynamic historians, but they're also more than historians. They are sensory studies scholars. And you know, a good example of that, first of all, is Tin Cugelj. Tin obtained his doctoral degree in historical museology at the University of Bern very recently, February 2024. So he's a freshly minted graduate with a PhD, but he's incredibly involved and implicated in mobilizing sound studies, in particular, as a founding member and co-chair of the International Musicological Society study group in auditory history. Now, they have events going on all the time. We try to keep up and we try to keep people abreast of all the events that are happening in this group, which is quite dispersed in its territorial localization. And Tin is really the driving force behind this very important branch of sensory studies. He is also an active musician performing on historical trombones across Europe and North America. And this follows the principles of historically informed performance practice. So that means bringing the sounds of the past back within earshot. It's an extraordinary challenge. It involves, not just recovering the instruments, but also uncovering so much more about the sensuous epistemology of a given period. So Tin is going to begin, and he will have up to 20 minutes to present his paper, and then there'll be roughly 8 minutes for questions and answers. So, you're welcome to prepare them. And his presentation is called Death Was Chasing Us, the Sea as a Sensory Agent of Early Modern Community Formation.
So before starting, I want to thank David and the organizing team for having me, but also to this space for hosting us. It's been truly a pleasure taking in all the inspiring scholarship up to now. So in September, I will start my postdoctoral project that examines how sound influenced formation and preservation of temporary communities. Specifically, I'll be looking at temporary pilgrim communities that traveled between Venice and Jerusalem in the early modern period. And I'm saying this because I need to explain how I came to this presentation today. While framing the postdoctoral project, I had a tough call. I saw the sea as a strong contender to sound in community formation. So while sound remains the project's central sensorial agent, I still felt the need to take a deep dive into this conundrum. So here you can see the results of my maritime exploration. If you have ever taken a trip as a part of a larger group, you may have noticed that every such a journey follows a familiar pattern. After determining the essential where, why, and when of the travel, purchasing the ticket and arriving at the station, whether airport, bus terminal, or boat dock, you were likely summoned to the departure point by the public announcement system. In that way, the modern journey mirrors the structure of late medieval and early modern pilgrimage, particularly the route from Venice to Jerusalem, which linked a European cosmopolis to a sant of trance and interreligious significance. After pilgrims declared their intention to travel, they entered into an agreement with the transport provider, securing their place on the vessel, essentially purchasing a ticket by signing the contract. It was just a bit bigger. For the modern traveler, the journey begins with the sound of the PA system. For the early modern pilgrim, it was the sound of the trumpet. As Jean de Tournai observed in 1488, I quote, "When the trumpet starts sounding from street to street, pay close attention, for at the third blast you must promptly board the galley. After the trumpets have sounded 3 times, 2 shots will be fired from a cannon, and at that point, if you are not already on board, you will be left behind and will have lost both your journey and your money, as the captain will not wait for you." It is not much different today as well, right? Once aboard, pilgrims found themselves confined to a narrow, often crowded space. Some were assigned to special quarters, others were packed below deck. Yet all shared the same delineated space of the galley. If the cramped conditions do not suggest a sense of community, it is precisely through the narratives of those who traveled that this collective identity emerges, often expressed through the use of the quote-unquote communal we. The metaphors that arose to describe these experiences further underscore the communal bonds formed. Felix Fabri imagined the galley as a monastery, Bartolomeo Crescenzio saw it as a mobile city, and the anonymous pilgrim for Végoncé described it as a perfect religion. These metaphors of community come alive in the sensory descriptions of early modern travelers. On 13 October 1494, Italian priest Pietro Casola described the harrowing experience of a storm in the Aegean Sea, writing that, I quote, "The sea was so agitated that every hope of life was abandoned by all. I repeat, by all. The storm became so violent that every man fled below deck, and it was no use to say, 'This is my place,' because in that hour, all things were common in our despite. Death was chasing us." In his vivid depiction, Casola conveyed not only the physicality of the storm, but also the emotional and sensory experience of being caught in it. Was Casola describing only his own experience, or was he capturing the group's collective experience? Given his monastic background, Casola was attuned to the communal nature of his environment, but his words seemed too forceful and consistent to be dismissed as an exaggeration for narrative effect. His final admission suggests not only an awareness of the communal aspects of his experience, but also a recognition of the profound sensory overload he endured. I quote, "If I have described this voyage at too great length, I beg my readers to excuse me, because those who ask me to tell them about it wish me to write thus." That was his friends. It is this very sensory intensity, the palpable threat of death, the deafening storm, and the overwhelming communal fear that I seek to explore in this paper. Traditionally, the sea was treated as an inanimate medium of maritime mobility. With Fernand Braudel, the Mediterranean becomes, quote-unquote, a protagonist, not a prop, an agent of human life and transformation. Steve Mentz and Blue Humanities foreground environmental impacts of the sea, implying we can treat the sea as an actor influencing human experience. Moreover, while many have recognized ships as floating communities or microcosms, Benjamin Arbel's work prefigures the idea that the environment of the voyage shaped a temporary community, although his focus was on social and cultural dynamics broadly rather than explicitly on sensory experience. Sander Henny and Sur Shalev asserted that the journey itself was integral to the pilgrim's experience. Deborah Howard treated the ship as a ritual and domestic space, while Mirko Sardalic dealt with their emotional landscapes. Building on these studies, I argue that the sea, in its own chaotic and multisensory manner, functioned as an active sensory agent, one that played a central role in the creation and preservation of temporary maritime communities, of the communal we. Thus, through a close reading of Casola's pilgrimage narrative, and in comparison with other accounts, I will explore how the sea acted as a catalyst for collective experiences, shaping both the individual and the communal in the context of maritime travel. In doing so, I will address the role of the sea in the multisensory perception of the journey, the influence of environmental factors on communal identity, and the broader implications for understanding early modern travel as a sensory experience that transcended the individual and created a shared collective bond. The moment the pilgrim's foot left the Venetian quay and reached the galley's deck, the body became the sea's first point of conquest. Santo Brasca in 1480 warned the future pilgrims to secure, I quote, lodging in the middle of the galley and near the middle door in order to have a little air, lest the movement of the sea wreak havoc on the head. From the outset, spatial choice was dictated not by comfort or status, but by hydrodynamics. The midship zone, least prone to pitch and roll, was suddenly prime real estate accessible to those whose social privilege allowed them a choice. The sea, quite literally, could reorganize human geography. Yet even the coveted center could not insulate those who experienced the maritime travel for the first time. Casola recorded that, I quote, "The greater number of us, both pilgrims and also the friends who accompanied us, were already upset by the sea, and I more so than the others because I had never been to sea before." As in the opening citation, bodily distress overrode social differentiation. The wealthy Milanese canon, the anonymous deckhand, the devout widow, they all bent over the rail with equal urgency. Seasickness became the great leveler, rinsing away accustomed hierarchies and compelling a nascent sense of us. That leveling extended beyond physiology to the very arrangement of space. Casola noted that, I quote, "All on board were anxious to reach Zara," which is today Zadar, "and as many of us were new to the sea, it was more disagreeable to us than even to the sailors." The ship's hold, once imagined as a sequence of separate compartments, officers' cabins, pilgrim dormitories, storage bays, dissolved under the pressure of collective nausea. Pilgrims crowded the gangways for air, sailors napped where cargo had lain, and privacy succumbed to the choreography of queasy bodies seeking equilibrium. In 1546, a Czech pilgrim, Oldřich Prefat z Velkanova, pointed out exactly that. I quote, "But below deck, there is also nothing cheerful, for everything creaks and cracks, and the waves from the outside strongly beat and smash against the ship from all sides and cause a great noise and commotion within the ship. From inside, it seems as if many little men with several logs from all sides are rushing towards her, pounding and striking her. It is just as lively below the deck as if someone had locked one in a barrel and others were beating the barrel with sticks, and everyone understands how it is to be in a barrel in such a way." I must confess, I don't know how to be in a barrel in that way. I don't know if anybody else has the same experience. Importantly, the language of Casola's discomfort is already communal. Although he singled himself out as the most afflicted, his narrative default is the first person plural. We were upset, we wished to reach port. That grammatical choice marks the earliest stage of a transformation whereby private instability became shared condition. It is not a coincidence that later writers such as Felix Fabri or Bartolomeo Crescenzio imagined the galley as monastery or floating city. The seed was sown before in the groan of timber, the stench of bilge, and the syncopated lurch that dragged every stomach into synchrony. Two implications follow. First, it seems that sensory assault was not a side effect, but a constitutive dynamic of maritime pilgrimage. The sea was not a backdrop, it was the stage manager dictating block and movement. Second, it is suggested that community was forged not by lofty theological discourse, but by the immediacies of inner ear and gut. The quote-unquote communal we proceeded from a choreography of bodies pitched together by external force long before formal devotions or shared aspiration crystallized. Thus, in this opening movement of our journey, Prefat's note that the nave turns, I quote, "steamy, stuffy, and foul," end quote, during storms, reminds us that smell and airlessness join motion in leveling rank. We witnessed the sea's earliest lesson. Before pilgrims contemplated Calvary, they must have learned to inhabit a vessel that itself inhabited the water. In mastering or failing to master their own vertigo, they began involuntarily to master the grammar of community at sea. That is beautifully portrayed in de Vergonzé's 1615 pilgrimage manual. I quote, One must resolve early on to be patient and to pass the time according to the company and place, eating both cooked and raw, fresh and salty, cold and hot, and drinking sweet or bitter according to the requirements of the time and location. One must become accustomed to resting amid the noise of waves and winds and amidst the loud shouts of sailors during bad weather. Oftentimes, one must endure them passing back and forth over one's belly as they go about their work, often releasing, as they come and go, gusts of wind aimed elsewhere than at the sails. So the best approach is to give them plenty of room and avoid being in their way. Despite these affronts, one should continue to address them as gentlemen, greet them politely, show them kindness at all times, and even offer them food and drink from one's provisions, lest they help themselves from the chest, which they are quite adept at unlocking. In short, it is the surrendering of personal comfort, respecting the sailor's work, and a practice of constant small courtesies that kept a volatile space from tearing itself apart. If seasickness leveled bodies, the sea's caprice with wind and weather distorted something more abstract, the traveler's very sense of time. What strikes Casola after his first bout of nausea has subsided is not the regular pulse of oars or the predictability of a timetable, but the way hours dilated or collapsed under the sea's governance. He reported an eerie, almost preternatural stillness shortly after departure. I quote, "After the said hour, however, there was a calm at sea which so fixed the galley that it remained quite still until night." Motion ceased, conversation fell to whispers, and the chronometers of muscle and mast stopped ticking. Pilgrims used to the bustle of Venetian quays inhabited a floating cloister where minutes felt like days, the drip of bilge water only metronome. A second such calm recurs outside Zara. I quote, "There was a great calm at sea, and the galley could not be moved with the oars because it was too heavy. Here, weight replaced wind as tyrant. Time thickened, purpose congealed, and destination receded into abstraction. This stagnation is what Bernhard von Bredenbach in 1486 called, I quote, a tedious tranquility or bonanza, end quote, ruining his own liturgical timetable. In this suspended moment, the community was confronted with its own impotence, an awareness that binds rather than fractures." Casola's panic echoes Arnold von Harf in 1488, who, I quote, never thought to see daylight again, or Niccolò da Poggibonsi a century earlier, who confessed aloud when his galley of Crete splintered under waves. But the sea abhorred equilibrium, and for many communities, the auditory omen arrived first. Prefat reports how, I quote, "the sky began to roar, and a very great and terrible sound moved over the whole sea." Casola's storm continues. On Wednesday, the 18th of June, the storm began to show all its grandeur. Suddenly, time snapped, contracting to the length of a wave crest. Casola watched experienced sailors scour decks in panic, heard confessions shouted against the wind, and observed restitution of both ill-gotten and legitimate goods performed at breakneck speed, as if moral arithmetic might outrun breaker and squall. The vigil of saints Protasius and Gervasius became an inverse feast, stomachs locked by fear, hours telescoped into an unblinking present. 3 days later, deeper in the archipelago, the sea renewed its assault. I quote, "Various winds arose, which drove the galley into the open sea, to the great perturbation of the stomachs of the pilgrims and sailors," end quote. This was no passing squall. It was a protracted reordering of temporal expectation. Casola noted that the storm continued all the following night, bending what ought to be restorative darkness into an extension of jeopardy. Night, normally the calendar's margin, became indistinguishable from day, while the repetitive blows beat out an irregular liturgy far more authoritative than any church bell. He said, "So terrible were the blows given by the sea, and the great mass of water dashed over the galley." At Ragusa, today Dubrovnik, the sea demonstrated a third trick, the tyranny of thwarted arrival. The anchor line, 600 feet long, failed to find bottom. Land was visible yet unattainable. Frustration with geographic stasis fused with fatigue from temporal distortion. Hours spent staring at the immovable coast felt longer than days at sea. Casola's most graphic temporal vertigo arrived in the open Gulf of Quarnero, today Kvarner. We drifted at the mercy of the sea with nothing but the sail I mentioned above. The fury of the sea was greater than I can describe. Those mountains of water appeared as if they would engulf the galley. Mountains rose, galleys plunged, and each interval between crest and trough stretched long enough to rehearse every prior sin. When the galley survived the night, dawn revealed a calm, I quote, so quiet that it appeared a glass of water, end quote, indicating how silence could distort duration by suspending all motion. So what do all these oscillations do to communal consciousness? First, they synchronized bodies in hearts and voices. In storm, every pulse quickened to the tempo of the pounding hull. In calm, speech slowed, bodies sagged, awaiting the next command from wind or providence. Second, they recalibrated the pilgrim's theology of time. Continental schedules, feast days, contractual departure dates proved porous relative to the divine chronometer manifested in weather. Third, they supplied a shared narrative spine. Later in port, when recounting the voyage, no pilgrim said on 18 June at 4 p.m. Rather, they said during the great calm or in the night when we thought we will die. Meteorological episodes became temporal bookmarks. Casola's prose itself absorbs this elasticity. Lengthy, languid sentences record doldrums, breath-short clauses puncture the storm passages. His syntax teaches us to read with the barometer. And there lies the sea's second pedagogical lesson. It warped duration, obliging the community to inhabit an alien temporality where divine caprice, not human design, measured progress. If bodily distress forged a rudimentary solidarity and shifting weather stretched the pilgrim's sense of time, the sea's third lesson is delivered on the plane of conscience and imagination. Under extreme sensory pressure, travelers did not merely endure, they moralized and metaphorized what they felt, converting nausea and terror into ethical action and vivid imagery that bound the group at an even deeper level. A glimpse of what the community might have become appears when the galley paused at the island of St. Andrew near Ragusa. I quote, certainly it is a place adapted for monks, remote from all society, surrounded by the sea and with beautiful gardens. In Casola's mind, the isolation of the islet, guaranteed by water on every horizon, mirrors the enforced enclosure of the galley itself. The vessel can now be imagined as a floating cloister, noisy, yes, but still a space where moral discipline and collective devotion might flourish. That cloister fantasy collides with brutal reality on 18th June, when the storm began to show all its grandeur. Here, the sea became a confessional booth. Casola watched as, I quote, great restitutions were made, both of what had been well taken, as well as of what had been ill taken. Merchandise, trinkets, even unpaid debts were returned in haste before the next breaker lands. He himself kept the vigil of Milan's patron saints by, I quote, fasting in the Moorish fashion, end quote, not from ascetic zeal, but because fear had sealed both stomach and throat. Physical queasiness slid seamlessly into moral queasiness. The body's revolt demanded a spiritual counter-gesture, and the shared practice of restitution and fasting tightened communal bonds more effectively than any sermon. Little wonder Prefat, as many others, could still declare that whoever shunned sea travel had, I quote, not seen one great, mighty, marvelous divine wonder in this world, end quote. When language reached for a figure large enough to hold such dread, the sea obliged with mythic imagery. As a funnel cloud lashed the horizon, the captain identified it as, I quote, a very evil beast called Seal. If it encountered a ship, it would be thrown upside down, end quote. In that moment, the ocean ceases to be water and becomes corporeal antagonist, a leviathan whose breath rips at canvas and makes a theology of mere survival. Even seasoned mariners, as Casola reports, stood in great wonder to watch this thing, their professional detachment dissolved by the spectacle. Storm rhetoric pushed beyond animal metaphors and anthropomorphized the sea itself. Bredenbach calls the Adriatic so ancient that in tempests, I quote, it raises great rocks from the depths and tosses them across the gulf, end quote, an image of geological fury that dwarfs human agency. But terror alone could not sustain a narrative. It required contrast, as previously seen in Casola's glass of water metaphor. Silence and stillness now carried an uncanny charge, as though the sea had calmed yet keeps the threat of return humming beneath the deck planks. Calm, too, invited metaphor. Pilgrims compared the mirror-smooth water to a Eucharistic chalice, an omen of respite or a deceptive siren's smile. The image was collectively generated and instantly shared, another adhesive in the mosaic of community. Inevitably, the pendulum swung back. Entering the Carnero, such a storm arose that it seemed as they must founder. The blows given by the sea were so heavy, and such a quantity of water was thrown on the galley, that they all thought we should be drowned below deck. Casola's prose stumbles into breath-short clauses, mimicking the sea's blows. Yet even here the Pilgrim's first-person plural holds. We must founder, we were drowned. The metaphor of collective fate is no longer rhetorical. It has become the only syntactic option available to minds welded by peril. Steve Mentz calls this a shipwreck epistemology, a moment when oceanic violence reframes knowledge itself. Thus, the sea's final tutorial is double-edged. Sensory extremity precipitates ethical reckoning and spawns powerful metaphors. Both responses, ethical and figurative, reinforms the quote-unquote communal we that bodily nausea first sketched and warped time had deepened. By compelling pilgrims to imagine themselves in monasteries, inside beasts, or beneath the Eucharistic glass, the sea finished the work it began the moment the trumpet called them aboard. In these minutes, I traced an argument through Casola's crowded ledger of discomfort. The early modern sea was not an inanimate medium of travel, but active agent of human togetherness. First, it seized the body, rolling stomachs and rearranging space so thoroughly that social rank ceded to midship real estate. Next, it warped duration, stretching hours in glossy calms, compressing them in lightning-lit tempests, and forced the ship's populace to breathe in a syncopated collective tempo. Finally, it invaded imagination and conscience, eliciting restitutions, fasts, and a bestiary of metaphors in which monks, monsters, and mirrors jostle for explanatory power. Taken together, these sensory pressures forge what Casola instinctively voices as a we, a transient but cohesive maritime community. Such a conclusion nudges us to refine two larger historiographical claims. First, environments, especially volatile ones, possess agency not because they think, but because they act upon bodies and senses in ways that reorder social relations. Second, community formation in the pre-modern world cannot be understood solely through institutions, doctrines, or economics. It must be eavesdropped through the groan of hulls, the slap of waves, the reek of bilge, and the words people found or failed to find when those sensations overwhelmed them. Were we to follow other travelers, a generation later, a century earlier, we would doubtless meet new calms, fresh storms, alternate beasts of wind and cloud, yet the grammar would remain intelligible, for it is written in the same salt on skin, in the same lurch of deck beneath uncertain feet. To attend to that grammar is to hear, across 5 centuries, how death was chasing us, could become paradoxically the birth cry of community at sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tin, very much. And I was hearing echoes of Emile Durkheim all through your presentation. Emile Durkheim and the idea that God, the idea of God, for example, is rooted in the experience of the social. And you're looking at how environment, has this profound impact. I don't think we really understand that all that well right now. We will pay for that ignorance, but the urgency that you described was extremely forceful. And it's, there's a lot of work on imagined communities, Benedict Anderson and so forth. But those are produced by media. What I think really we need a lot more research on, and you are doing that here, is sensed communities, okay? Communities of sensing. So we do have just a few minutes for any questions that might arise from the audience, or if not, I've got another one that I'd like to put to Tin. I find really compelling this idea of sensorial agency, that nature is not just a backdrop, that actually it's an agent, and it's bringing about these quite remarkable reactions, like all of a sudden restitution. Okay? Got to get my debts in order, got to clear my soul because it seems like death is imminent, and so there is that attempt to write accounts. And in that connection, what is the understanding of nature that emerges, of the natural that emerges from this? I mean, doesn't one call these things acts of God? These storms, these tempests, is that not part of the language of the time.
Maybe I should come to, maybe I should
Yes,
come to
or
this
actually, we
microphone.
can just move this over. You're welcome. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay.
Or this.
Yes. Why don't you go with that?
All these microphones. Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I feel that the nature still does not take the identity of God in all these narratives, even though these are all spiritual people. They all do believe in God, and they all do believe in God's will. But I still cannot read any of the animate action or agency or whatever in nature. I cannot read it as a godly entity. I always read it as, yes, God's will, yes, God's action, but through an extended, some kind of distal hand, right? And this is what happens throughout the narratives for like 300, 400 years. It is always God punishes us, therefore the sea is violent, therefore the sea is attacking us, right? It is almost as the sea has its own identity within the greater conversation between God and the believers, no? So I do believe it's a really clear, separate identity than just a manifestation of God.
Excellent. So I'm going to kind of follow up on that, I think. First of all, it's a wonderful paper. Thank you very much. So the sea appears, right, throughout your talk and throughout these narratives that you're dealing with. And I'm wondering whether there's any more subtlety to it than that. Are people referring to particular passages on the oceanic kind of voyage as having particular agency or particular characteristics? So can we move beyond the sea to think about different kinds of seas, different currents, different passages?
Yeah, definitely. Different seas do appear to have different identities, and most of these accounts that I've mentioned today are all talking about the Adriatic Sea, which is the first point of entry between Venice and Jerusalem, right, if you go in that direction. And this is also true today. That is still the most tumultuous part of the Adriatic, and it still has this identity of the unruly, stormy, messy, very violent sea. A lot of these have happened in the Gulf of Quarnero, which is just near Rijeka today. It's more towards Venice, very like in the north. The reason is very geographic. There's a lot of winds, and there's always some kind of mess there. But the identity that Quarnero has gotten throughout the history is that one of the Devil's Gulf. Interestingly, devil, not God. It has gotten the identity of an angry part of the sea. It's an angry gulf. It tries to attack. It provokes. You never know what's going to happen there, etc. So this is kind of manifesting to the whole of the Adriatic Sea. And whenever they go out, so they pass Albania and they come into the Aegean doesn't have this idea. Then the identity becomes separate events, which is just a storm, which means that it probably didn't happen that often to gain this kind of historical identity that's spread through time, right? And then, yeah, the sea is then just the sea. It is just the Mare Nostrum. It's just the Mediterranean. Will become the specific points. They become mythologized and gain this higher identity in a way.
Okay. Please, Celia. Yes.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in how that multisensory experience of the sea during a crisis, like a storm, like can create this kind of collective identity. And also if you can talk a bit more about what you were mentioning about synchronized bodies. That was very interesting for me, for what I'm going to talk later.
I think these two connect very well together, right? And this is something that would happen to us today as well if we would enter a reconstructed galley and we would be caught in a storm in the Adriatic. If you are not experienced traveler, your body would react the same way theirs did. Your proprioception would be completely messed up. Your body would react to the environment, and simply the adrenaline hits, your heart rushes, and everybody's adrenaline hits because they're all in the same event. Therefore, everybody's heart rushes, right? So the environment itself kind of stacks them together into the same kind of beating community. And this was my first thought when how I even came to this idea of that the sea itself creates this community. It creates it through this corporeal agency, through yes, embodied experience, right? And this is exactly what underlays the whole thing. So even when it's calm, and they're all calm and relaxed and don't have anything to do, so they say they're bored, it is the same thing, right? They are completely normal again. They don't feel anything, etc. There's the smallest of difference in those who have experienced maritime travel and that those who didn't, as Casola has really nicely said, and those who don't experience nausea and those who do. But even in those, the whole community still feels the most terrible of storms, where they react in the same way, right?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce Andy Flack now, who's from the University of Bristol in the Department of History. Andy is also one of the founding members of the University of Bristol Senses and Sensation Research Group, which is another one of the many hubs in the international network of sensory studies scholars. Andy is an environmental historian with a specialization in the sensory dimensions of past people's encounters with the wider natural world. For today's talk, he's going to extend his net even wider and talk not just about the natural world, but the supernatural world. And so this is an interesting and very compelling opening. What's especially fascinating about the trajectory that Andy's research has been on recently is that he's been exploring the period since 1800, various contexts, from the UK and North America to Australia, of how naturalists use their bodies and technologies to explore dark worlds. That is, the deepest caves, where there was no light and where they encountered creatures whose eyes had atrophied, which was just sort of unthinkable to scientists who depend so much on their sight to know the world. Andy has a book called Dark Natures, a fascinating study of darkness, which is very problematic from post-Enlightenment perspective, which will be coming out with the University of Chicago Press. But again, now it's as an environmental historian interested in the supernatural that he will be speaking.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction, David, and it's a pleasure to be in Montreal for the first time, and in Canada indeed for the first time. I've really enjoyed it, and it's brilliant to be in the fourth place too, so thank you for having me. So, today, I want to talk to you about something strange. So the year is 1855, and we're just a few short years after the Great Exhibition, that symbol of power and industry and science and rationality. It's a symbol of the mastery of the world. It's the morning of the 9th of February, and we are deep in the south of England, in the county of Devon. At the dim winter's dawn, residents of many villages in the region arose to find some strange markings in freshly fallen snow. They looked like hoof marks, and they meandered through villages and gardens. Sometimes they did impossible things, marching straight through stone walls, climbing up drain pipes, across rooftops, and through haystacks in the barren, cold fields. In some villages, almost every home had been visited. And in total, over 30 villages were allegedly affected by this nocturnal phenomena. The residents of Devon were up in arms. Something strange had clearly walked the winter's night, leaving bone-chilling clues in its wake. The tracks themselves usually fell in a single line, as if left by some kind of bipedal creature. Rather than alternating, they fell one in front of the other. They were usually the same size, ranging between about 1 inch and 4 inches, with a stride of between 8 and 16 inches. In total, the trail seemed to proceed uninterrupted for over 100 miles. How could a single earthly creature leave such impossible tracks in the snow? So many of those who first encountered these tracks were relatively familiar with the tracks left by a wide range of nocturnal creatures. They knew such signals of the nighttime quite well. But even they were left confused and frightened by what they saw in the snow. Some thought it was the devil himself, Satan or Old Nick, walking in their midst. They knew, of course, that he did this quite regularly. This was not unusual, but his signs were usually difficult to see. And they were terrified of going out after dark in the weeks that followed, should he be waiting for them somewhere in the darkness. But there were many more earthly explanations that were offered to explain these tracks. It might be a monkey, escaped from a travelling menagerie, or a kangaroo, also having fled from captivity. Others were sure they were the tracks of a badger. Others said, no, not a badger, clearly a mouse, or a heron, or a great bustard, or a rat, or an otter, or a cat, or a hare. Many, many explanations were offered. And within a few hours of their discovery, several parties of locals had attempted to identify and follow the footprints to find their maker. Many supposedly walked miles and miles in freezing pursuit. Some found strange whitish excrement left next to the footprints, supposedly left by whatever creature had walked the night. Others noticed that the tracks mysteriously stopped and then started again, as if the offending creature had taken flight for a short distance or engaged in a very long jump before landing again some meters ahead. Several locals produced illustrations of the tracks in the snow. We can see them here. There's a few examples of those tracks as they were recorded. While scientists weighed in with their own explanations, Richard Owen, of dinosaur fame, but also, as it turns out, really interested in cryptozoology, was certain that these were the tracks of a badger simply out walking in the dark. None of this, however, could explain the fact that the fact, in inverted commas, that these tracks went on for 100 miles. No creature could do that on its own. And no single explanation explains the phenomenon as it is presented to us in the sources that are left to us today. Indeed, the sources are fairly scant. They're very thin on the ground. There are several newspaper reports, but there are very few first-hand accounts. And there's nothing from anybody who followed the tracks across their whole supposed length. What we have then are fragments of something strange, or at least fragments of something that some people thought to be strange. To complicate matters further, this event became folklore. Those who saw the devil's hoof marks never forgot them, and they told the story of their perception of these strange signals for years to come. And the print media sporadically returned to them over the decades that followed. Each time that they did, new witnesses came forward with their own stories of what they saw and heard that night. One aged lady remembered distinctly in 1890, so that's 35 years later, that it was definitely a kangaroo that had made so many people terrified of going out at night for so long. Even those who spoke up at the time seemed to add new details when they recalled the events many years later. So I want to think about why this kind of event, situated in space and time, might matter to historians of the senses. I'm just starting to think this kind of thing through, so it's a bit raw, and I'm really interested to hear what people think. What might something so strange and perplexing and apparently inexplicable tell us about sensory pasts and presents? Well, not least, this is a story that is really about a fundamental uncertainty, a sensory uncertainty about the very nature of the world. and that uncertainty is filtered through the senses. Crucially, the process of making these hoof marks took place in the darkness. As I've suggested elsewhere in my work, it was in the remnant dark, those dark places that remained in the midst of the illumination of the world across the 19th century, or parts of the world. And it was in those remnant darknesses where one could not see or know or sense with certainty that the ancient, the primal, and the otherworldly could still be found. Supernatural elements of an earlier age lurked full of life in the 19th century night. The persistent connections between gloom, murk, shadow, and the ethereal suggest that in the West, the 19th century world was not necessarily one of sweeping rationalization as we often think it to be. A rationalization that had somehow wiped the landscape clean of awe and wonder, superstition, and doubt about the very nature of the world in which people lived. Now, what do I mean by elements of an earlier age? Well, the darkness of the early modern world, in Britain, was a place of very substantial danger. Ghouls, goblins, demons, and boggarts, for instance, and hobgoblins, were some of the malignant supernatural residents of an invisible domain ruled by Satan, or that some thought was ruled by Satan himself. For many people, witchcraft was directly associated with the shadow of night, a place of intimate, sometimes very literally, relationship with the Dark Lord and his minions. The relative absence of illumination in most places, especially on nights when the moon and stars were obscured by clouds, meant that vision was generally impaired, and the dark wayfarer reliant on unstable lights, his candle or lantern. The indistinct soundscape, vagueness of what could be heard in the world, possibly touch, the touch of his feet, the tactility and hapticity of the body. Sometimes smell, and certainly their own sense of their body moving through the world in an uncertain way. They relied on all that constellation of senses to keep them safe in a natural and supernatural world. And this could produce a profound sense of vulnerability in that dark world, and those vulnerabilities frequently found supernatural explanations. There are other examples of this. So, for example, the phenomenon of lights appearing in the unlit boglands, luring dark wayfarers away from the beaten track. This is a natural phenomenon, it's real, but it was explained through the work of an imp, a will-o'-the-wisp, jack-o'-lantern, or wildfire, is an artist's depiction of what that might look like. And these were supernatural beings, impish agents of evil, glowing like lanterns in the gloom and luring people away from the beaten track into the dark. Now, that said, it is a misconception that early modern people understood everything they experienced through the lens of supernatural belief systems. From the 17th century in the West, the Enlightenment, the rise of cultures of scientific understanding, added new dimensions to the ways in which natural worlds and natural phenomena were understood. And as a result, the world came to be, the world through which people moved was increasingly experienced through both scientific and supernatural sensory lenses, or sensory paradigms. And these ways of knowing related to each other in really complicated ways. Diverse ways of sensing and knowing, experiencing and explaining an uncertain world could meet each other, science and the supernatural sharing common spaces. This was especially true in the dark, where the association between darkness, death, immorality, and the otherworldly remained very strong across the period and continues to this day. And I think we find that in relation to the devil's hoof marks in 1855, we find this constellation, this set of uncertainties and interesting relationships between natural and supernatural sensory explanations and experiences, because they're laid down in the obscurity of the night, beyond vision, beyond the ability to survey something in action. The evidence of terrifying activity in the dark burst forth only at the break of day. And this is significant. As we enter the modern period, since around 1800, science and technologies like the lighting of towns and cities were frequently seen as heralding the wholesale banishment of evil forces in the face of civilizing light. But events like the devil's hoof marks, and there are actually many more besides that I'm starting to find, show us that this is far too simple an explanation. Across the 19th century and into the 20th, reports of possible encounters with allegedly supernatural entities, almost always at night, consistently emerged. And while expanding artificial light offered more and more people the means to see and therefore control the world in which they lived, whatever might be lurking in the night, monsters, fairies, and demons, simply drifted into what shadows were left. Writing in 1858, so that's really close to our footprints in the snow, the British journalist James Augustus St. John wrote that, quote, "On the outskirts of our prestigious city, where the sheen of its gas lamps mingles with the light of the glowworm in the fields, beliefs as ancient as the world still prevail in unimpaired force. And there are scattered examples of persistently supernatural ways of thinking and explaining the world. And they are fragments, I think, of a rich supernatural mosaic that we would do well to look more at. The senses, their fallibility, their vulnerability, and their relationship to the body and the wider sensorium were crucial in perpetuating such ways of experiencing and understanding the world. Elements of the uncertain, the strange, the supernatural remained cast across the darkest places and spaces of modernity. Such doubts about the essential nature of the world characterized many people's engagement with night natures, even if they are often ironically difficult to easily identify in the historical archive. But if we look closely, we can find those moments of doubt about the reality of the world. According to the historian, my colleague, William Pooley at Bristol, who is flirting with sensory history, I'm trying to convert him, we're getting there. He wrote that doubt was like the dark matter of the archival record, often absent from the traces left for us because they were frequently fleeting and imprecise, and difficult to articulate. Incohesive thoughts and feelings about and responses to a world that was inherently uncertain. But this does not mean at all that such ways of thinking did not exist. We need to read between the lines to find those clues. And the devil's hoof marks give us a window, I think, into that uncertainty, illustrating it for us and drawing our attention to the sensory foundations of that uncertainty about reality. People could not see what made these marks. Their vague traces were all that were left for people to try and interpret. A lack of certainty could conjure monsters in the minds, even of otherwise rational people too, rational in inverted commas. So we have this even in the works of naturalists. A British naturalist of the mid-1850s, Thomas Edward, for example, spent his nights walking in the shadows, trying to understand the fragile and fairy-like moths that he would encounter on his night, his dark wayfaring. But he was also alive to the sounds, smells, and twilight visions of the nocturnal world in all its dimensions. One dark and cloudy night, a large mass crossed his path, stopped, and began moving slowly towards him. The darkness, he said, was thick, and he could not discern what kind of creature really lay in front of him. This uncertainty bred doubt. And he wrote, "Well, if every limb did not shake like an aspen leaf, and every bone in me did not crack and quake with downright fear as I beheld the hideous-looking beast, what kind of creature could this be? What grisly apparition or midnight monster or unearthly thing? Certainly he had never seen the likes of it before. It was as strange as a sea serpent, the existence of which he admitted to being increasingly, though not fully, inclined to doubt. He was ready to turn and bolt in fear, but courage took hold of him, urging him to be a true naturalist, even if he did suspect the being before him to be the old boy or Satan himself. night walking in some hideous form. Upon peering more closely into the gloom, trying to find cloven hooves or horns atop the creature's head, he found to his enormous relief that it was not one animal at all, but 3 adult badgers plodding together through the night. His lack of vision animated the darkness, transformed the world into something more than itself. His uncertainty about the nature of reality, conjuring forth a dark nature travelled by many denizens, some of them from other realms. The devil's hoof marks, along with these sorts of instances, suggest to us that broader environmental conditions, too, played a key part in that uncertainty. The environmental conditions of the time were really unusual if we dig into them. Much of Britain had been in the grip of a particularly severe winter. The rivers Exe and Tyne had frozen over for part of their lengths. On the night of the 8th, 9th of February, that night when the footmarks appeared, snow fell really heavily from midnight, but soon the temperature rose and the fallen snow began to melt before the temperature dropped again, refreezing the snow in the act of its thawing. And this meant that the sensory expertise, the visual identification of animal tracks as a means of knowing what wildlife had been abroad in the dark, was rendered essentially useless because the tracks had transformed. So specific environmental conditions had warped and distorted those usually fairly reliable sensory clues. And this created the conditions also for uncertainty and the mental space in which the otherworldly could be discerned. So events like the appearance of these prints in the snow and more isolated personal encounters, like our naturalists who stumbled upon the old boy in the darkness, suggest to us that it may be the case that for lots of people during this period, including highly skilled naturalists working in the dark, that the limits of their senses meant that supernatural entities were possibly present, the night in particular perhaps inhabited by otherworldly beings. In the dark, shadows were cast by moonlight and cloud in a never-ending array of constellations, and the source and movement of sounds could be concealed by that darkness. Flickering, unstable, dim yet warm candlelight created visual worlds that could not be trusted, while strange markings could emerge only at the rising of the sun, their origins concealed by the darkness. This shaped feelings and experiences of place, provoking anxieties, raising fears born precisely from that doubt and uncertainty. The darkness can be so physically variable that one moment to the next, it can change. And so culturally loaded that even for people of science, it is quite possible that a wide range of scientific and supernatural thoughts and feelings, different paradigms emerging through sense, could share the same spaces as they moved through an unfamiliar shadow world, and as they encountered the traces of that unfamiliar world at the dawn. But the origins of the devil's hoof marks remain an unsolved mystery. You can look them up on the internet. Nobody knows what made them in the darkness of that freezing winter's night back in 1855. The dearth of source material left for us means that it will probably always remain a mystery. There's no one around to give us any more information about it. But that said, similar prints have emerged since. In 1946, giant footprints appeared on the Isle of Wight, heading towards the famous Needles rock formation before disappearing entirely at the edge of the cliff face. In 1957, mysterious cloven hoof marks appeared overnight on a beach near Hull in the UK. Had the devil walked in England again? People asked. Perhaps historians of the senses might look towards phenomena like this more intently. They might reveal much about the nature of the world and the ways in which senses and sensations shape our encounters with this world and many others. Thank you very much.
Wow, Andy. There was a whole field of history inspired by anthropology. Keith Thomas, Religion and the Decline of Magic, other very prominent historians, they were all doing the history of mentalities. So it was a question of rationality. And how can we make sense of this seemingly foreign idea of belief in witches and so forth. So they looked at the presumptions and they looked at the modes of reasoning. You're bringing in the modes of sensing. And I think that that's really an interesting turn for environmental history, that it's not just the idea of nature, not just the idea of the environment, but the sensory conditions of perception that you're bringing out. And just where the limits of perception are, there the supernatural, can enter in. And so this element of darkness, I think we have a very hard time now, us moderns, understanding darkness because everything is so well illuminated. And so a history of darkness, such as you are writing, is extraordinary. You're not doing a history of caves. You're doing a history of a particular kind of sensory environment, that of darkness. I think this is really where sensory history goes. It's so different from the history of mentalities, okay, which was all that stuff so concerned with rationality. And you don't have the same trouble with rationality or irrationality because you're looking at the sensory conditions that support this. An extraordinary exploration. Now, I hate to curtail questions from the audience, but in order for us to be able to get all of the presentations out, let's have Celia do her presentation, and then we will have time, and we can go over time as well at the end. Celia is an FRQSC postdoctoral fellow at the Moving Image Research Lab at McGill University. She is a psychologist, and I'm not going to hold that against you. Okay, we've been challenging the authority of psychology, and a visual artist and creator. I think that makes you so much more than a psychologist. She explores kinesthesia, movement, kinesthetic empathy, and the use of the sensorial body in 1970s feminist performance. And she is going to be introducing us to a very unique methodology that she employs to tap into another moment in sensory history. Celia.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for the fourth space, which is a great place to be presenting. I visited the Reina Sofia Museum archive in Madrid. It was one of those heavy summer days, over 40 degrees Celsius. My body felt both weighed down and strangely expanded by the heat. My skin warmed and my breath slowed. Entering the air-conditioned archive was a relief that my body registered instantly, a soft exhale, a wave of lightness. I drank water, my throat dry from the walk. The archive coordinator greeted me kindly and had 10 video performances by the Cuban-born artist Ana Mendieta, ready for me to view. One of the first pieces I watched was Butterfly. My invitation to you now is to experience a few minutes of this piece through your sensory and bodily perception. I invite you to bring your attention gently to your breathing. Notice how the air enters and exits your body. You might feel the coolness of the air as it moves through your nose and how it leaves slightly warmer, more tempered. Let that awareness of the breath guide your attention to the rest of your body, to how you are seated or standing, to the edges of your body and the space it occupies. Notice the surface you are in contact with. Perhaps become aware of the front of your body, the part closest to your vision, and also the back of your body, the part you cannot see but can still sense, maybe by feeling the contact of the chair against your back. From this state of embodied attention, I invite you to watch a few minutes of Butterfly. As we watch this 2 minutes excerpt, allow your attention to rest not only on the visual composition, but on your own body. What sensations emerge? What changes in posture, temperature, or breath? What movements, memory, or resistance does Mendieta's presence call it for you? Her video does not only ask us to see, It invites us to remember, to sense, and to locate our unembodied narrative in hers. I remember watching it in near silence. Mendieta's body appears still, naked, surrounded by lights that flicker and shift, lights that expand and contract the edges of her form. The image pulses with color, processed with a 16-channel video system that intensifies both the chromatic and emotional resonance of the piece. My attention wasn't fixed solely on what I was seeing, but rather in what I was feeling. How her apparent stillness invoked a different kind of movement within me, a subtle but insistent sensory awareness. Her still body was not immobile but expansive. It was charged, resonant, quietly powerful. I had the strange sensation that my own body was growing, as if expanding outward by just a few centimeters, echoing the visual expansion of Mendieta's body in the image. At certain moments, it almost felt that I have wings were emerging from her, projected not only through the image, but through her presence. In those moments, I could feel a faint tingling across my back, as something within me recognized the emergence of those wings, as if my own body was echoing the transformation unfolding on the screen. There is something evocative about Butterfly that suggests it may draw from Mendieta's own stories in the childhood. A well-known photograph shows her as a 4-year-old in Varadero, Cuba, dressed in white and wearing wings. That image seems to echo through this performance, as if reactivating an early gesture of transformation. Perhaps that is part of why this piece resonates so deeply with me. I do have a photograph from my childhood taken on the rocky shore of Cabo de las Huertas, a Mediterranean cape where I grew up, wearing a white dress, gazing outward. What woman doesn't have a photo of herself dressed as a princess, in a white gown, or as a fairy? These images speak to the collective imaginaries imposed on women from childhood, roles we were taught to embody long before we can question them. Years later, I revisited that image with my own artistic practice, using it as a foundation for a multidisciplinary project involving printmaking, textiles, and video performance, in which I also incorporated wings onto my body. This gesture, this visual memory, resonates with Butterfly in unexpected ways. Perhaps because our movements in research creation, like embodied gestures, often emerge from a collective imaginary. Even before encountering certain artworks, we may find ourselves performing similar actions, as if these gestures are already inscribed in a shared somatic archive. It was during this period that I began to understand what I would later define as kinesthesia, the sensation of movement and corporeal gesture, as well as kinesthetic empathy, the ability to perceive and connect with the movement of physical experience of others through one's own bodily sensations. This form of bodily understanding is something I had unknowingly experienced before. I read the concept while swimming laps at the Olympic pool in Montreal. On one occasion, I observed a high diver preparing for jump. Though I remained motionless at the water's edge, I experienced the leap in my own body, the muscular tension, the trajectory through the air, and the eventual release. This moment, though seemingly incidental, revealed an early instance of kinesthetic empathy, an embodied resonance with the physical experience of another. Kinesthesia, as discussed by Roger Smith and further explored in interdisciplinary studies, not only anchors individual embodiment, but also facilitates a somatic mode of knowledge, one that connects the observer to the performance gesture through internal sensation. This embodied mode of perception emerges as a methodological tool for engaging with performance not merely through visual or textual analysis, but through the body's own capacity to perceive, resonate with, and remember movement. Thus, kinesthetic awareness becomes central to a sensorial methodology that situates the body as both a site of inquiry and a medium of understanding. Building on this, scholars such as Deidre Sklar and later D. Reynolds and Matthew Reason, as well as Susan Leigh Foster, within the field of dance studies, have further articulated kinesthesia and emphasized the concept of kinesthetic empathy. This body capacity not only to perceive its sound orientation, movement, and gesture, but also to physically and affectively attune to the emotion and emotional state of others. Their work reinforces the idea that embodied perception is not passive, but generative, allowing the researcher to access performance through lived, felt experience, thereby foregrounding the sensorium as a valid and critical epistemological tool. These theoretical contributions open the way to a set of core research questions that guide this paper. What does it mean to know something somatically through movement or other bodily sensations? How this mode of learning relates to other sensory ways of knowing? And how might it challenge or expand dominant paradigms of knowledge production? Furthermore, what possibilities emerge when embodiment is foregrounded, not only as a methodological tool, but as a site of political and personal liberation? These questions frame an inquiry into sensorial methodologies that consider not only the researcher's own body as a site of knowledge production, but also the traces or unembodied gestures of the historical subjects being studied. This methodological lens finds also a compelling example in the work of the Mexican video artist Paula Baez. In her videos, Mi Corazón, Autovideato, and Mujer Ciudad Mujer, Baez explores her own corporality through choreography, gesture, and vibrant visual effects, crafting a multisensory language that extends beyond the screen. These works are not merely representations of a moving female body. They are proposals for a way of being in a space, a way of feeling the body, of affirming its presence, its weight, its rhythm. Baez's experimental videos become sites for feminist corporal agency, where the body does not serve as an object of control, but as a source of expressive and political power. Like Ana Mendieta in Butterfly, Paula Baez uses video not just as recording tool, but as a space of embodied transformation. By applying the concept of kinesthesia and kinesthetic empathy, I approach this work not only as aesthetic pieces, but as embodied propositions. They ask us to consider what it means to move, to feel, to occupy a space as women whose bodies have historically been constrained or rendered invisible. Both Baez and Mendieta offers us routes for imagining liberation, not in grand gestures, but in the intimate, felt knowledge of the body. Their videos performances construct somatic maps through which feminist agency and emancipation become not abstract ideals, but grounded bodily experiences. Building on these insights, I have applied this sensorial methodology in my research creation practice. I began to focus intently on what my own body was doing while watching videos or examining photographic archives, attuning myself to subtle sensations, micro-movements, shiftings in breath, posture, and emotional responses. It became clear to me that this was not merely a mode of interpretation, but a form of knowledge, one grounded not in distant criticality, but in lived felt experience. This embodied research creation methodology extended in my own practice as I began to recreate selected actions from the works of artists I studied. For example, in this one is The Return by Fina Miralles, or Adalt del Arbre, Up the Tree, by the same artist, where I engage in a performative response, like exploring the relation between the body and the landscape through balance and stillness. Similarly, drawing from the same artist, Fina Miralles, El Cos covered de pedres, body covered by stones, I recreated the act of covering my own body with weight and textures, activating the tactile memory and somatic intensity of the original gesture. Or in Triangle, by the Catalan artist Àngels Ribé, in which the artist appears life-sized, performing a gentle, continuous up and down movement that gradually traces with her own body the 3 lines of a triangle. These performances were not about imitation, but about entering into a dialogue with the physical traces and emotional resonances of the past, allowing my own body to become a site of inquiry, transmission, and transformation. Through these performative reenactments, I generated spaces of sensorial empathy with the performances, using my own body as a medium to perceive, inhabit, and make visible the latent potentials for bodily awareness embedded within them. These practices have served as a distinctive mode of unpacking my research questions. Placing and moving my body in ways similar to those of the artists became a method for gathering knowledge about their performances, knowledge that would not have been accessible through language, description, observation, or visual analysis one. To activate the archive in an embodied way, I also organized screenings designed to center the viewer's kinesthetic experience. These events aim to create spaces where spectators are not passive recipients of moving images, but somatically engaged participants. How can we engage with these body images in motion? How might we activate, in an embodied and affective way, feminist archives from the past? These questions guide my efforts to not only show historical performance, but to reanimate its political and emotional force through the body of the present-day viewer. I developed participatory workshops following each screening. Grounded in kinesthetic awareness, these sessions invited participants to engage in a somatic exploration of stillness and movement. I proposed focusing on specific gestures or movement patterns drawn from the artist's performances as a way to reconfigure our connection with the filmed bodies, perhaps disrupting habitual corporal routines and opening up alternate modes of relation, perception, and presence. One participant reflected on the experience in the following terms. For me, it was a workshop in which I discovered how body and thought go hand in hand. The surprising thing was how, after viewing the pieces, my body gave me an answer to the questions that the works raised, and how they could be conceptually united as a result of bodily research on the duality of rigid and ultra-controlled movement versus a more fluid movement without predetermination. These testimonials illustrate the generative potential of a sensorial methodology, not only as a mode of inquiry into historical performances, but as a transformative experience in itself. Through these workshops, participants accessed a form of knowledge that emerges through bodily engagement and somatic attention, demonstrating how feminist archives can be reactivated not solely as materials for analysis, but as catalysts for embodied affective and collective experience. To conclude, the process of reperforming and physically inhabiting these works allows for a deeper awareness of the felt sensations that arise from the entire performative experience of engaging with films, videos, and performance. This embodied engagement does not merely represent these works, but reactivates them, creating a bridge between the past and present, and opening spaces for new interpretations and insights. This highlights the significance of empathy and embodied experience as crucial tools for activating feminist media archives in corporeal and somatic ways. It calls attention to the act of thinking, sensing, and feeling the weight of embodying moving images from the past and reflecting on the bodily actions embedded within them. The question then becomes, what does it mean to know feminist media archives somatically through movement or other bodily sensations? Or how can we act of reperforming these works reveal hidden dimensions of feminist agency and knowledge, inviting us to reimagine the possibilities of these images and gestures in relation to our present-day bodies? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celia. In contrast to what I would describe as sensing between the lines in work art to on textual sources, you're taking images and videos from another time, and by reperforming them, arriving at a kind of insider knowledge that is different from that one that is based on text or based on, for example, just a visual analysis. Now, interestingly, there was a movement, an aesthetic movement, physiological aesthetics it was called, in the 1920s and 30s, and this consisted of some mostly high society people going to the Met, okay, and then reproducing all of the postures that they saw in a painting of a jazz club or this kind of thing. So the idea was that this was how you were to experience the aesthetic, through embodying it in just the way you're describing. And I think that, interesting thing about the feminist work that you're describing is precisely that the body is centered in that work. There's a whole politics of it, personal being wrapped in, and that in order to really be in touch with that tradition, that archive, you can't just look at pictures of it. Those are what remain, but what you're doing is you're trying to add, a physiological reaction to it itself. Now, these are the ways of sensory history, sensing between the lines, and also, through this kind of sensory performance that you were engaging. And you interestingly learn sort of about the agency of the body and the agency of women, through that. Certainly the feminism of that period, first wave feminism, right? Are we a bit jaded now that we're in the third or fourth wave? Can we feel as intensively as those women felt because they were resisting structures of domination? I really felt as though, you're positioning yourself in a way can see at opening up the archive. Are there questions from the audience? Would anybody there or amongst the panels themselves about the different methodologies? Tin.
Lovely. Yes. Thank you very much both for your presentations. I think I'll go from the back on, because Celia's work really reminds me of my own work in reproducing music of the Renaissance Baroque, and it's kind of the same mechanism behind it. Although we are very often, you have a privilege of working with video material that gives you so much access to how things were done. We usually reconstruct things from scarce textual things as much as I do with history, I do with this as well. So I was wondering if you have, what happens if you don't have the knowledge of the movement that you have to reproduce? Or can you experience this kind of kinesthetic empathy, or kinesthetic, how you could call it also, contagion, in a way, if you don't have the knowledge of the movements that are happening? In the case of the swimmer, you were saying about the jump, right? I don't have an idea how does it feel to jump from like 20 meters. Can I still get this instant reaction that can then connect to your own practice from like a bit more extended way? I hope I'm being clear, sorry.
Well, I think it's possible to do that from photographs. Actually, there are like this haptic way to connect to history through the archives, through the photographs. I think you know about that. And also, for instance, in your presentation, when I was seeing the photograph of the sea, I could have a sensation in my body about what it means to be in the sea. Well, I grew up by the Mediterranean, very like you, but maybe because of that memory, but also when I was looking at the traces of the heavy, like, the images that or the image of this darkness place. Like I could feel in my body some sensations. So of course the movement is giving us more information, but I think we can connect in this haptic way with photographs. Yeah.
Can I follow up? Okay. So that was really brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm really interested in like the performance of other times and places in that way. And so I wondered how this kind of empathy through dance connects to like the tradition of historical reenactments, for instance, like pretending to go into battle. And maybe that raises the question of the line between just like pure play or fun and actual empathy.
Can you redo the question? Are you talking about empathy? Is this a real empathy, or is something that we are pretending by reenacting?
Yes, yeah, the difference between pretense and empathy, or rather the same.
Yeah, this is a difficult question, and I was never thinking about exactly this specific situation, but I think it's an empathy that we are feeling throughout the body. So yeah, I think also there is like a difference between this reenactment that artists do with the pieces that they really want to repeat with the scores that they have the piece. And in my case, I was just trying to feel that empathy, actually. Maybe this is related to my background as a psychologist. Going back to this, because it's like was the way I was working with the people in psychotherapy. So it's like, for me, it was a real empathy. And also I was not doing like a piece of art. I was just connecting with this, what this artist could feel in that moment, if it was like real or not, but it was like interesting the way that I could find answers and also like build this kind of, maybe build this kind of agency like that I was asking.
So on this point, you know, Andy, there's a wonderful book, Sensory Worlds of Early America by Peter Hoffer, which is about the European experience of the New World, and it was very unsettling. Okay, they were using bonfires to feel or to see that they were within each other's, you know, scopic regime and bells and this kind of thing. But Peter Hoffer entered into a very interesting debate with Mark Smith. Mark Smith about this very question of historical reenactment. And, you know, I think Peter Hoffer believed that you could get in touch with the past. Mark Smith, I'm not sure, he's a dear friend, but I think that his position was that you can't. And he uses the example of lemon, okay? And I know this from personal experience. I know that when we used to get a clementine in the bottom of our stocking on Christmas Day, okay, that experience, because it was so unique of the clementine, they were so rare that truly was Christmas, just in that alone, okay? That was a tremendously powerful sensation. Now, the clementines you can have any time of the year. They don't come from Morocco only at a certain time. I cannot taste a clementine, and I'm still looking for those clementines that I enjoyed as a child because that burst of flavor was so powerful. And so for all of this historical reenactment, I mean, I think that you're very principled as musicians, you know, because you really insist on trying to get the sound right. Maybe not always. Yeah, okay. You allow yourself some leeway. But it's really interesting, this question. Can we recover the past? Can we sense the past? The title for this is Sensing the Past. That's Mark Smith's book, published by University of California Press. It was something else, Sensory History, in the English edition, which was from Bloomsbury or Berg. So, you know, really interesting questions, deep epistemological questions. And I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface of them. I think really, you know, what we've brought out in this extraordinary exchange, you know, is the challenge, you know, is kinesthetic empathy possible? And to me, you know, what I was thinking about seeing that, the woman, was that where are her wings? Okay, this is called butterfly. Where are her wings? Well, her wings were all the way the body came in and out of focus in a field. And so that was an extraordinary meshing of body with environment. Okay, sometimes you could see the contours, other times you couldn't. That was an extraordinary expansion of the body that I think you've experienced as well through that means. Okay, we have 2 questions and then we'll close. Mark, first of all.
Bring a microphone over.
Yeah,
Here,
there you
right
go.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I actually agree with the that butterfly piece. It is because it's almost a deception, and you doubt what you're seeing, which kind of fits in with Andy's talk as well. That you know, what are you seeing slowly in front of your eyes? It's a wing, and then it's not, and then it's part of the body, and then what is this? I just wanted to say though, Celia, like about agency and about authority in this, because you have. You know, from what my understanding of Deirdre, and also the Susan Foster as well with kinesthetic empathy, is that it's not necessarily about the artist and their feeling and re-inhabiting another artist. It's also about the audience, right? So that there is no necessary need to know how to do a complicated piece of movement, that actually there is enough empathy in the act of watching, and that some of this has had some kind of empirical verification as well in terms of MRI scans and so on. Because I know that some of the people in Berlin who were doing this as well. So I just wondered, well, to what extent is this, are you privileging a form of feminist bodily agency and knowledge? And to what extent we non-artists and non-feminist artists can actually, I mean, I know that there's enough that privileges us white guys already, but I'm just wondering, you know, to what extent, you know, that it's in the eyes and body of the audience to kind of see and then to understand and to feel, because I thought that was part of the point of what they were writing. So that's kind of the first question. The second thing is also Barbara Montero. Are you aware of her work as well? Barbara Montero. So she's actually a kind of philosopher of aesthetics, and she's looked at proprioceiving somebody else's movement. And it's very interesting because, you know, can this be an aesthetic category in itself to actually watch somebody dance? And that's what she's interested in, and that's what she publishes about in journals of philosophy. I just thought I'd let you know about that.
Please. You know, we'll have your question. We might have to carry the conversation on outside of this official frame.
Okay, so my
please,
question,
last question.
I have one question. So I was directed at Andy, really fascinating paper, you're a wonderful storyteller. But I was started to think about what David said about our contemporary exposure to light. And I just wondered how might these historical experiences of darkness, like the one that you told about the Devil's Hoofprints, how might they inform contemporary efforts to reclaim sensory engagement with the nocturnal, or I don't like the term rewilding the night, but that kind of thing.
There's the whole dark sky phenomenon, you know, which I think speaks to. Can you just address that?
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Really good question, and it's something that I've been thinking about. Not necessarily getting any answers yet, but I suppose that the case that I make in my book when it eventually appears is that actually it's not enough to worship the night sky, and that a history of darkness and a history of dark sensation should also reorientate us to the darkness that's around us and how we feel it. And that when we feel it, it's a mixture of emotion and sensation, and that we could be receptive to other worlds. Like, I'm not at all, I guess what I do in the book is, I don't in the book want to invalidate these intangible, sometimes deeply personal experiences of what may or may not be there. I think it's super valuable and it enriches people's experiences of place. So what I say very vaguely in the book is that maybe paying attention to our senses in the dark can reveal other dimensions to the world, whatever those dimensions might be. And that's part of rewilding. It's not only about turning the lights out, and actually that's more complicated than it sounds, but it simply is about turning and facing and feeling the dark in all its various ways. Sorry if that's a vague answer to your question.
It's a call to arms. Okay? Embrace the dark. Okay? Spurn the light. I love it. I love it.
Well, yes, if we have just one, or Minus, if we have is related to the question you were asking, how the agency is related with the kinesthesia, and if we can feel that even if we are not feminist or artists, etc. I think this is also was elaborated by Carrie Noland. You can look at her book. She's talking about how agency is related with the sense of kinesthesia. And that's why I was like, because I was studying from the feminist lens, my research, I was finding like Carrie Nolan was not being from feminism, but was connecting how we can really elaborate agency through this kinesthetic sense. So I invite you to read more about that, because she really connect these two concepts. So it's not something I was inventing now. Like it was like she was reading this, like she was writing about this way, and it's not related to feminism only.
Thank you, everyone, very, very much for this afternoon's session. A wonderful close to the day. And now I invite you to fill up your senses by going to the gala banquet, where we promise that as a result of all the stimulation you'll receive, will make up for having diminished your senses back at the initial insipid banquet. And so the other thing is that Quebec's national dish will be served, its contribution to world cuisine. And many of you will know what that is, but if you don't, you have a great treat awaiting you. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our panelists. Those of you in the audience as well, and those of you joining us on Zoom and on YouTube, we will be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now. Just reminding you, this remains available on our YouTube channel. You should revisit it, you should share it, and you should have a really great banquet. And thanks for coming in.